Welcome to Wolfe's World, quiet, precise, and always a step ahead. Tell us where you're listening from. Liking and subscribing helps support the channel and the next case. Now, follow the clues. Nero Wolfe and the taxi Saul took alone. Under the steady hiss of rain, West 35th Street looked like it had been lacquered in black glass. Reflections from the street lamps trembled in the shallow puddles, breaking apart when the occasional motorcar passed, its tyres whispering over wet asphalt. The hour had thinned the traffic, but the city still murmured under its breath, as if even the weather couldn't quite hush Manhattan. I'd shut the front door and locked it for the night, sliding the bolt with that familiar click that meant the brownstone was sealed against the world. Fritz had gone to his room after making his final inspection of the kitchen, and Wolfe was still in the office, settled into the yellow chair like a man who'd taken root. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it, the softened growl of an engine slowing against the rain. Through the glass panel beside the door, I saw the hazy outline of a taxi pulling to the curb. Yellow, though the street lamps made it look the colour of old brass. The cab idled there for a moment, wipers moving with a deliberate rhythm before the rear door swung open. Out stepped Saul Panzer. Saul wasn't the sort to pay for a ride without a reason. If he wanted to see us, he walked or drove himself, never calling attention. And yet here he was, hat brim low, coat collar up, rain purling on the fabric. His outline was familiar, but there was a stillness to him that wasn't. I stepped down from the landing, unfastened the bolt, and opened the door before he had to knock. "You're picking a damp night for a social call," I said, leaning against the frame to let the rain stay where it belonged. He stopped at the edge of the stoop, but didn't mount the steps. "Evening, Archie?" His tone was even, but the words were tight. If you've known Saul as long as I have, you can hear when there's weight behind them. "You planning to get wet out there, or do you want to come in where the chairs are dry?" He gave a small shake of the head. "Not tonight." The driver, a man in a flat cap, looked at me once in the mirror and then away. The meter ticked on, numbers changing in their own slow cadence. Saul kept his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze not quite meeting mine, instead slipping past my shoulder to the second-floor window where a faint glow would be visible from the street. Wolfe's light. "You came all this way to stand in the rain?" I asked. "Had to see the place." He adjusted his hat brim, as though the rain were finding a way under it. "That's all." "You just needed a glimpse of our brickwork. I can send you a photograph next time." The corner of his mouth twitched, not enough for a smile. "Tell him." He stopped, the words hanging in the air like the steam from his breath. "No, never mind. That was not Saul's style. He finishes what he starts." I took a step onto the stoop, the damp air curling around my collar. "If there's something on your mind, not now, Archie. Soon, maybe." His eyes flicked down the street, and for the first time I realized how intently he was listening to the night beyond us. A car passed 2 blocks away, headlights cutting briefly through the mist, and his shoulders eased only after the sound faded. "Stay sharp." He gave the doorframe a light tap with 2 fingers, then rapped twice on the cab's glass. The driver shifted into gear, and the taxi pulled away, merging into the thin stream of traffic until the tail light was just a blurred ember in the rain. I stayed on the stoop longer than I should have, the drizzle threading through my hair and making a polite invasion of my collar. Inside, the brownstone's air wrapped around me like a heavy coat. I hung up my own in the hall, then made my way to the office. Wolfe was exactly where I had left him, but the book that had been balanced in his hand earlier now rested on the desk blotter. His eyes, deep-set and sharp, despite the soft edges age gives a man, were fixed in my direction. "Panzer?" he asked. "Yes," I said, brushing a bead of water from my sleeve. "And?" "Just stop to say nothing," I told him. I stayed by the globe stand instead of taking a seat, not entirely sure whether I wanted to settle into the red leather just yet. Wolfe made a low sound, not quite a grunt, and reached for the book again. The light from the desk lamp pooled over the pages, leaving the rest of the office in that mixture of shadow and amber glow I'd come to think of as Wolfe's preferred weather. I didn't mention the matchbook Saul had turned in his hand like a worry stone, not because I wanted to keep it from Wolfe, but because the time didn't feel right. By the time I went up to bed, the rain had eased into a finer mist, and the streetlight shadows were stretching farther across the ceiling. Sleep wasn't quick to come. The image of Saul's eyes, measuring the street before turning back to me, played behind my own. Morning came in that slow, grey way it does when the sun can't quite muster the will. I was in the kitchen with coffee when the phone rang in the hall. Fritz glanced up from the counter, but I was closer. "Goodwin," I said into the receiver. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Mrs. Greeley." The voice was pinched, anxious. It took me a beat to place her, Saul's landlady, a woman of firm opinions and firmer rent deadlines. "Yes, Mrs. Greeley?" I don't like to trouble you, but Saul hasn't been home since yesterday afternoon. His bed wasn't slept in. That's not like him, not without telling me." The coffee in my hand cooled faster than it should have. "You're certain?" "I'm certain, and I heard him talking to someone on the telephone before he left. Sounded urgent. He was out the door right after without his supper. I thought perhaps he'd mentioned to you." "No," I said. "He didn't." She sighed, the sound a fragile thing. "If you hear from him, will you tell him to call me, please?" "I will." I hung up and stood there with the receiver still warm in my hand, staring at the wall as if the plaster might offer a suggestion. Wolfe's voice floated from the dining room, where he'd begun his breakfast. "Mrs. Greeley?" "Yes." I stepped into the doorway. "Saul didn't come home last night." Wolfe's fork paused halfway to his mouth. His expression didn't change, but I've known him long enough to recognize the shift in the air when his mind picks up a thread. He set the fork down with deliberate care. "Phooey," he said softly. "He came here last night." "Yes." And said nothing of consequence. That's putting it mildly. He sat back, steepling his fingers under his chin. Then something of consequence was in what he did not say. I took a seat, the coffee finally cooling enough to drink, which leaves us wondering what that was. The rain had stopped by then, but outside the street still shone with the memory of it. I could almost see the taxi again, the way it had waited in the hush, engine idling, Saul inside with that look that meant he was already halfway gone. And in that moment, I knew the case, whatever it was, had already arrived on our doorstep. Only this time, it hadn't come in. The doorbell rang at 11:15, sharp enough to slice through the last sentence of the Gazette editorial I'd been reading aloud. Wolfe's lips flattened, which in his emotional range qualified as a snarl. Orchid time was an hour away, but any interruption before lunch was a trespass. I went to the door. Fritz, from the hall, gave a look that meant he was safely nowhere near the latch. I opened it to find Inspector Kramer on the stoop, coat collar turned up against a light drizzle, cigar jammed in the corner of his mouth like a fixed bayonet. The smoke curled upward and dissolved into the damp. "Goodwin," he said, "your boss in?" "Where else would he be?" I stepped aside. "Wipe your shoes. Fritz waxed yesterday." He grunted, brushing past into the hall. Wolfe had not risen, but had closed the Gazette, marking his place with the exact precision of a man who considered sloppiness a mortal sin. "Inspector," he said, not warmly, "you have news." "Yeah, and you're not going to like it." Kramer took the red leather chair without waiting to be invited. Water speckled his coat shoulders. He tugged out the cigar, set it in the ashtray I slid over, and leaned forward. "Your boy Panzer. His cab was found this morning downtown." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. I was not aware he possessed a cab. "Spare me," Kramer said. "A hired one. Parked halfway down Maiden Lane, driver's gone. No one saw who left it. Keys in the ignition." I took out my notebook. "And Saul?" "Missing. And before you tell me he's off on a fishing trip, I know Saul Panzer doesn't vanish without saying something to somebody. Which is why I'm here." This was in the back seat. From the inside pocket of his coat, Kramer produced a clear envelope sleeve and handed it over. Inside was a torn piece of heavy stationery, pale cream, the corner of a monogram barely visible. The handwriting on what remained was neat, slanted. "To Miss Delia Grant," I read. "Hotel Sutherland." The bottom edge was ripped, the kind of tear that comes from haste rather than neatness. Wolfe extended a hand, and I passed it over. He studied the paper, turned it to catch the light, and set it down on the blotter as though proximity might contaminate his desk. "Who is she?" Wolfe asked. "Ask me in a minute," Kramer said. "Right now, I want to know if Panzer was working for you. Off the books. Something you didn't want your name on." "No," Wolfe said, the word carrying the weight of granite. I have not employed Mr. Pantzer in 3 weeks. The last assignment involved the location of a man's errant nephew, which he performed with his usual efficiency. Kramer watched Wolfe's face as if expecting a twitch or slip. Wolfe gave him nothing. "Then what's he doing in a taxi with a note to some high-tone address?" I asked. "And the driver?" "Name of Anthony Rizzo, licensed hack out of West 70th. No record, no complaints. Neighbours say he went to work like always. Last fare on his log was 8:47 p.m. Pick up West 35th, drop off." Kramer flipped open his notebook. "Entry ends with South and a blot." "South Ferry," I suggested. "Or South Street," Kramer said. Either way, somebody didn't want him finishing the word. I crossed to the globe stand, spun it half a turn, and stopped it under my hand. "Hotel Sutherland. That's near Madison and 42nd. Kramer nodded once. "You know the place?" "I know it for having guests who don't want their names in registers anyone else sees," I said. "Private dining rooms, back elevator to the alley. And they're discreet enough to make a confessional look like a gossip column." Wolfe's mouth compressed. "You are suggesting illicit commerce?" "I'm suggesting," I said, "that if you wanted to hand something to a woman without the whole lobby knowing, that's where you'd do it." Kramer jabbed a thumb at me. "That's my guess too, and I think Pantzer was the one doing the handing. Question is, what and why?" Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, a habit of his when sifting chaff from grain. If Mr. Pantzer was acting privately, it was without my counsel. His prudence is sufficient to prevent foolish errands, which leads me to suspect this was not foolish but necessary, and for reasons he preferred not to share. "That's nice," Kramer said, "but I've got a driver gone and maybe worse, and a name in the back of his cab that leads to one of your associates. You can see why I might think you're holding out." I leaned back against the wall. "Inspector, if we were holding out, would we be sitting here politely instead of pretending not to be home?" Kramer gave me a look. "You might. He wouldn't." He pointed at Wolfe. Wolfe ignored the jab. "Inspector, you may be assured that should I acquire information relevant to Mr. Rizzo's whereabouts or Mr. Panzer's condition, you will be apprised at once. Until then, I recommend pursuing the hotel's records." Kramer snorted. "You think they'll hand them over to me without a fight? They don't hand them over with a court order unless you threaten to close the kitchen." "They are punctilious in the maintenance of their client's privacy," Wolfe said. "But you have resources." Kramer rose, taking the sleeve with the torn envelope. "Yeah, and one of them is leaning on you until something shakes loose. Don't leave town." The door closed behind him with more force than necessary. I went back to my chair. "You believe him?" I said. "I believe," Wolfe replied, "that he is sincerely motivated to find both men. That sincerity may be sharpened if we decline to waste our own time." I tapped my notebook. "Delia Grant, shall I?" "Yes. Ascertain her origin, present circumstances, and any connection to Mr. Panzer. Discreetly. If the Sutherland is her residence, it will not be inexpensive." I stood, sliding the notebook into my pocket. "Discretion I can manage. Expense I'll put on your account." He lifted one eyebrow. "Naturally." Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, and by the time I reached the curb, the street had that sheen again, the one that made last night's visit from Saul feel less like a coincidence, and more like the first movement of something we hadn't yet heard in full. The Hotel Sutherland wore its reputation the way a cat wore its fur, sleek, well kept, and with claws out of sight until they were needed. I stepped in from the wet and into a lobby scented faintly of polish and cigars. The lighting was deliberate, just enough to flatter, not enough to expose. A man behind the desk lifted his head, gave me a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes, and asked if he could be of assistance. "Miss Delia Grant," I said. "She's expecting me." That was a gamble. Wolfe hadn't sent word ahead, and I doubted Miss Grant kept a standing list of callers. But the clerk only nodded once and gestured toward a pair of armchairs near the elevator. "If you'll wait, sir, I'll inquire." The chairs were upholstered in a fabric that could have been red once and might be again if the lamps ever burned brighter. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the front doors and the length of the lobby. It's a habit I've never shaken, knowing who comes and goes before they know about me. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped out as though the floor itself had announced her. Delia Grant. Young, poised, the sort of face that made Boston society columns run out of adjectives. The blue veil she wore was fine enough to barely miss her features, a courtesy to modesty rather than a shield. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. I stood. That's right. I appreciate you making the time. We moved to a small lounge off the lobby, where the sound of the street was a memory. She sat with her hands folded lightly on her lap, gloved fingers still. "You've met Saul Pantzer," I began. Her eyes didn't flicker, but her posture gave itself away. "Once," she said, briefly. "When was that?" 3 days ago. He came here. Said he had a message for me from someone he didn't name." "What was the message?" She looked past me for a moment. "That I was to be careful." "That's it?" "Yes." Her tone was level, but it had the flatness of something rehearsed. "From whom?" "I'm afraid I can't say." "Can't or won't?" Her veil shifted slightly with her breath. "Both." The silence between us was comfortable for me, less so for her. She adjusted her gloves, a small motion, but her gaze slipped past my shoulder toward the lobby. I let my own glance follow, slow and casual. A man stood near the front desk, flipping through a newspaper he hadn't turned a page on in the minutes I'd been here. Tall, shoulders squared under a well-cut coat, his hair combed back with precision. He gave the impression of someone who had long ago learned to be patient when it mattered. "You know him?" I asked. Her head turned back too quickly. "No." The answer came faster than truth should travel. I kept my voice easy. "Because he's been keeping that paper open to the same page for 10 minutes. Either he's waiting for someone, or he's the slowest reader in Manhattan." She offered a faint smile that didn't light her eyes. "I'm sure it's nothing." "Maybe," I said. "And maybe he's interested in who you talk to." "I told you I don't know him." She wasn't going to give me more, not here. I rose and she followed, smoothing her skirt. "If Saul contacts you again," I said, "tell him I'd like to speak with him. It's important." Her agreement was polite but non-committal. We returned to the lobby together. She crossed to the elevator without looking at the man by the desk. He didn't look at her, which told me more than if they'd nodded. I stepped out into the rain. A block away I stopped at a shop window, its glass mottled with drops, and in the reflection saw the man leave the hotel. He turned east without haste, the newspaper now rolled under his arm. The name would come later, Henry Calvert, shipping agent. For now, he was just another shadow with a purpose, and I was going to find out whose. The telephone rang at 9:30, and Wolfe lifted his eyes from the Morning Gazette just long enough to look at me. That meant it was my job. I picked it up, expecting a routine message or a client's nervous inquiry. Instead, I got Kramer's voice clipped enough to scrape the paint off the receiver. "Goodwin, I want you down at Pier 27, now, and bring your hat." He didn't elaborate, which meant two things. He was in a hurry, and he wanted me to see something before Wolfe got a chance to shape my reaction. I told Wolfe where I was headed. He grunted, which could have meant disapproval, caution, or that the eggs were slightly overcooked. The rain had let up to a damp mist, and the air along the Hudson had that metallic tang you get when the wind shifts across the docks. A uniform at the pier entrance waved me through after a word from Kramer, and I followed the sound of men's voices to a warehouse whose doors gaped open like a tired jaw. Inside, the light was poor, filtered through grime-smeared windows, and the smell was a mixture of old wood, salt, and the faint copper edge of blood. The body lay near a stack of crates marked for export, a man in a dark overcoat, one arm bent under him at an angle no living shoulder would tolerate. His hat had rolled halfway across the floor, stopping under a pallet. "That's Anthony Rizzo," Kramer said, stepping up beside me. "Hack license number matched. Shot once in the chest. No wallet, no watch." His tone suggested he'd already filed those details in a mental drawer marked robbery, but the set of his jaw said he didn't quite believe it. "Where was he found?" I asked. "Not here. He was in the cab when a dock worker spotted him slumped over the wheel. Whoever dumped him moved the body in here before we got the call." I crouched for a better look. His coat was damp, but not from the mist outside. The blood had soaked in and cooled. The entry wound was neat, a single black-edged puncture over the sternum. No powder burns, because the shot had been fired from at least a few feet away. "Any idea why here?" I asked. Kramer shook his head. "If it was just a robbery, why take the trouble? And why here, where half the stevedores in Manhattan could wander past?" Two detectives were working over a small clipboard on a nearby crate. Kramer jerked his chin at them, and one brought it over. "Rizzo's logbook," Kramer said, handing it to me. The cover was scuffed, the corners bent from use. Inside, the entries were neat. the times written in a careful block hand. The last page told the story. 8:12 p.m. 42nd and Lexington to Canal Street. 8:47 p.m. West 35th, South. The word ended in a blot. Ink bled into the paper where the pen had hesitated or been dragged. South what? I asked. Your guess is as good as mine, Kramer said. South Street, South Ferry, South Brooklyn. But here's the thing. This fare was picked up outside the same block Panzer was last seen on. That pulled the air a little tighter in my lungs. And you think Rizzo's last passenger was Saul? I think it's a damn good possibility, which means whatever happened to Rizzo might have been meant for him. The clipboard was still in my hands. I studied the ink. It hadn't been smudged by water. The blur was wrong for that. More like the pen had been pulled mid-letter, maybe by a jolt, maybe by the kind of surprise you don't get to recover from. I handed it back. And the cab? Empty, apart from a torn matchbook in the back seat. No prints we can use. We're checking the brand with local bars. Men were moving in and out of the warehouse now, their footsteps echoing in the high space. Outside, a foghorn moaned from somewhere downriver. You'll keep me posted, I said. Kramer gave me a hard look. Don't start running your own game on this, Goodwin. If Panzer's mixed up in it, I need facts, not Wolfe's theories. I'll pass that along, he snorted. Do that. And tell him the Sutherland's already on my list. He's not the only one who knows how to ask a question. I left him there with his men and stepped back into the mist, the tang of the river sharper now. Somewhere between West 35th and this pier, Anthony Rizzo had picked up a fare he shouldn't have, and the half-written Pier 14, if that's what it was, felt like a direction someone had been desperate to finish and never got the chance. The bell rang at 8:15, clear and deliberate. Fritz looked from the dining room doorway toward me, as if to remind me of the household rule that left the front door to my care. I put down the Evening Gazette, crossed the hall, and opened it to find Delia Grant standing under the awning. The mist outside had settled in her hair, making it glisten under the lamplight. She wore a dark coat with a collar of pale fur, and in her gloved hand was a slim leather bag. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, with a breath that was not quite a smile. "May I come in?" I stepped back and gestured her through. She moved into the hall with a glance that took in more than she showed, the kind of quick survey people make when they're deciding what to reveal. "In here," I said, leading her into the office. Wolfe was in his yellow chair, the evening beer within reach, and the glow from the lamp pooling on the blotter. He set down his book and regarded her without rising. "Miss Grant," he said. She sat in one of the red chairs, hands still gloved. "I understand you know Saul Panzer." "I do." Wolfe's tone was neither invitation nor refusal. "And you know where he is?" Her gaze dropped to her bag before lifting again. "No, that's why I'm here. I need you to find him." "For what purpose?" "He was carrying something for me. Family documents. Sensitive. They must be recovered." "And the nature of these documents?" Her pause was practiced. "I can't tell you that." Wolfe's brows lowered a fraction. "You can't, or you won't." She breathed once through her nose. "Both. What matters is they're important. He was to bring them to me here in New York. He never arrived." I asked, "Who sent him?" Her eyes moved to me, then back to Wolfe. "I can't name them." "That," Wolfe said, "is inconvenient." "It may be," she replied, "but it's necessary. The less you know about the sender, the better for everyone concerned." "Except Mr. Panzer," I said. She ignored that and opened her bag. From it she took an envelope and placed it on the desk. The flap was unsealed, and inside was a neat stack of bills, fresh, crisp, and in sequence. Wolfe didn't touch them, but I could see the serial numbers march upward without a break. "A retainer," she said, "and expenses." "You offer money in lieu of candor," Wolfe said. "I offer both where I can," she said evenly. "If you take the case, you'll be paid again when it's concluded." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers meeting at his chest. "I dislike working in shadow. You come here asking me to act without knowing for whom, and without knowing for what. That is a poor inducement. I'm asking you to act because if you don't, he may be dead." The room held still after that. Even the radiator's hiss seemed to recede. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, then opened. "Very well. I will undertake to locate Mr. Panzer, but I reserve the right to disengage if the constraints you impose impede me." She nodded once. Agreed. I took the envelope and slid it into the top drawer, making a note in the ledger. The paper of those bills had the stiff feel of cash that hadn't been folded twice. "Miss Grant," Wolfe said, "I will require a full account of your last meeting with him, and the time and place arranged for the transfer of these documents." She gave it, in clipped details, without embellishment. When she rose to leave, her posture was that of someone who believed the first move had gone her way. At the door, I asked, "If he calls you, will you tell him we're looking?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, "and I'll tell him you're the only one who can find him." The door closed behind her with the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hall. Wolfe was looking at the desk, not at me. "You noticed," he said. "The money? Crisp, sequential bills. Someone walked into a bank this morning and got them fresh." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And whoever they are, they have a reason to keep their name from us." I sat, took out my notebook, and wrote her name at the top. There were layers here, and Wolfe had just agreed to peel them back one by one. The Hudson has a way of setting its own terms. The nearer you get to it, the more it smells of work that doesn't stop for weather. Rope and tar, diesel and salt, the faint sting of rust from steel that's seen too many tides. By the time I stepped off the trolley and started down the long block toward Pier 14, the fog was beginning to lift, but the air still clung to my collar. It was the kind of damp that could put a crease in your hat brim and convince you that your shoes were made of blotting paper. Pier 14 was awake. Cranes moved with ponderous patience, lifting crates from the belly of a freighter moored alongside, swinging them toward stacks that already rose as high as a tenement. Winch engines coughed and steadied. Men moved in twos and threes, shoulders hunched against the wind off the water, their voices carrying in short, flat bursts of orders and replies. If you stood still long enough, you could feel the timbers underfoot hum faintly with the weight and movement of the work. I'd been here before on other errands, though never for pleasure. The piers didn't hand you answers for free. They were the kind of place where a stranger asking questions was either a nuisance, a mark, or trouble. The trick was to look like you were none of the above, but might still have something worth trading. Wolfe, in his yellow chair, had told me to find anyone who remembered Rizzo's cab the night before, and to note everything: times, faces, directions. He'd said it like he was ordering lunch, but I knew the menu in this case might include more than either of us liked. The first pair of candidates were leaning against a bollard just inside the pier gates, smoking as if they had a bet on who could turn his lungs into a chimney first. Their caps were pulled low, their coats heavy and stained with the kind of grime that takes a month to earn. I took out the photograph Kramer had let me copy from his file. Anthony Rizzo, the missing driver who'd turned up dead in a warehouse not far from here. "Either of you see this man or his cab last night?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Yellow checker, looked like it needed a coat of paint 2 years ago. One of them didn't bother looking. The other took the photo between thumb and forefinger, squinting at it. His eyes narrowed slightly, not from suspicion but the effort of memory. "Yeah," he said at last, tapping the picture with a fingernail. "Cab sat over there for a while." He nodded toward a patch of curbside halfway down the block, darker than the rest from oil and whatever the river wind had carried in. Didn't see the driver, just a guy getting out, middle height, nice hat, moved like he had somewhere to be. "Recognize him?" "Not by name," the man said, handing back the photo. But he walked fast, like he didn't plan to be here long, went toward the sheds. The other man shifted, as if deciding he didn't want to be left out. "Could have been your friend," he said, "but it was dark, and I wasn't paying attention. We had a load coming in." I thanked them and moved on, weaving between stacks of cargo and men with their heads down against the wind. Dock work is rhythm. You don't get in the way of it unless you like learning new curse words in quick succession. Further along, near where a crane was lowering a crate into the back of a flatbed, I found a stevedore coiling rope. He was tall, with the kind of shoulders you don't get from desk work, and his sweater had seen better decades. His hands kept moving even as I came up. "You see a cab here last night? Parked about 10 minutes. "Maybe," he said without looking up. "Plenty of cabs swing by." This one had a passenger who got out and left on foot. Neat suit, not dock trade. That made him glance at me. "Yeah, I saw him. Thin guy, good clothes. Didn't look like he was here for cargo." "And then?" He walked up the block and climbed into another taxi. That stopped me. "Another taxi?" Not the same one he arrived in? I know a hack when I see one, he said, pulling the rope tight around a cleat. Second driver was tall, built solid, had a scar here. He tapped the left side of his chin, not something you forget. Car number? Too far to read. Light was lousy, but the cab headed north. Fast. I let that sit for a second. Saul leaving Rizzo's cab for another, driven by a man with a scar, was a new wrinkle. It could mean Saul had planned it, or it could mean someone else had planned it for him. I thanked the man and made a slow circuit of the pier. Most of the answers I got were shrugs, some honest, some not. A few men remembered the cab, but not the passenger. A few remembered a passenger, but swore they couldn't describe him. But the line held. Rizzo's cab idled, the passenger got out, and then there was another taxi heading away from the river. Nobody saw where it had been hailed, and nobody claimed to know the second driver. By the time I reached the end of the pier, the fog was thinning enough to make the outlines of the warehouses stand out. The wood under my feet was slick, the planks worn smooth by decades of boots and weather. I stopped there for a moment, hands in my pockets, letting the picture form in my head. Saul in Rizzo's cab, then into another, driven by a man with a scar. It might have been a clean getaway, or the first step into a tighter corner. On the way back toward the street, I spotted an older hand sitting on a crate sipping coffee from a dented thermos. His eyes tracked me as I approached, but he didn't move. "You've been here a while," I said. "See anything last night?" "Maybe I did," he said, voice low. "Maybe I didn't. Depends who's asking." "Friend of the man who got into that second cab," I said. "The one with the driver who had the scar." That made him pause mid-sip. "Scarred fella, yeah. He's not one of the regulars. Didn't like the way he kept his engine running, like he was waiting for just that one fare." "Know where he went?" The old man shook his head. "North, that's all. Could have been 10 blocks, could have been 100. He didn't hit the lights at full." "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said, screwing the cap back on his thermos. "He didn't want to be noticed." Back on the street, I turned east toward the avenue, the river wind pressing at my back. The second taxi was no accident, that much was certain. The scar on the driver's chin might as well have been a calling card. If I could find him, I might find Saul, or at least the reason Saul had traded one cab for another. And I had the feeling Wolfe in his chair with his eyes half closed would already be deciding which of those possibilities was more likely to bring the truth home. The street outside Pier 14 still had the taste of salt in the air. The fog was lifting, but the wind off the Hudson could have sliced onions without a knife. I turned my collar up and headed east toward the avenue, boots taking the kind of steady pace that says you're not chasing anyone, at least, not yet. The longshoremen's voices faded behind me, replaced by the shuffle of the city's evening trade. Saul Pantzer had stepped from one cab into another, driven by a man with a scar on his chin. Northbound, fast, lights kept low. That wasn't happenstance, and Wolfe would agree, if only because it smelled of forethought. There was another thread to pull, and it had a name: Henry Calvert. I'd seen him in the Hotel Sutherland lobby during my talk with Delia Grant. He'd worn his patience like a well-pressed suit and kept his eyes on a paper he hadn't read. Delia had denied knowing him, which meant she probably did. Wolfe had raised an eyebrow when I'd mentioned him over the phone. For Wolfe, that was halfway to a handshake. The Sutherland was a mile and change from the pier. I caught a cab, one of the fleet that hadn't had its springs replaced since the last war, and let it rattle me along the river before cutting inland. The driver was the chatty type until I gave him the address. Then he went silent. The Sutherland wasn't the kind of place you explained. It explained you. Discretion in the front, business in the back, and enough velvet in the lobby to smother a confession. I paid the fare, stepped out, and took a moment before going in. The lobby lighting was its usual shade of gold wash that softened wrinkles and made a man's watch chain seem more impressive. The desk clerk gave me a polite nod, the kind that means they don't recall your name, but they recall you've been here before. Calvert was where I expected him, seated in one of the leather chairs near the far window, the day's Times folded on his knee. The glass behind him showed only the faint reflection of street lamps, the dark outside like a pane of polished coal. He was tall, even sitting down, with the sort of shoulders you don't find behind a shipping manifest, unless you've also spent time lifting what's listed on it. His hair was precise, combed straight back, and his suit was a dark blue that played at respectability without quite marrying it. I crossed the carpet, let my shadow fall into his line of sight. He looked up with a kind of polite delay, as though allowing himself a beat to register me before deciding if I mattered. "Henry Calvert," I said. "That depends," he replied, voice smooth enough to have been pressed with his shirts. "Who's asking?" "Archie Goodwin." I pulled a chair over without invitation and sat. "You were in the lobby the other day when Miss Delia Grant came through. You didn't look up from your paper, which was clever, except you didn't turn the page once in 10 minutes. Calvert's mouth gave a trace of a smile. I read slowly. "You watched quickly, though. You were watching her." He regarded me for a moment, then folded the paper with deliberate care and set it on the side table. "If I were, why would it matter?" "Because the man I'm looking for, Saul Panzer, had business with her before he disappeared, and you're standing close enough to that business to smell it." Calvert leaned back. "I don't know your Mr. Panzer. Saul's a private operative, one of the best. He doesn't misplace himself for fun. If you don't know him, you might know why someone would want him out of the picture." His eyes narrowed fractionally, as if testing whether I was bluffing. "You're making a chain out of very thin links, Mr. Goodwin." "I'm good at that. The trick is knowing when to stop before it breaks." He picked up the paper again, but didn't open it. "Miss Grant is a client of my firm. Shipping, freight forwarding, charter contracts. I've handled her late father's account since his death." "And she meets you in a hotel lobby instead of an office?" "Clients have their preferences. And some lobbies have back elevators." That earned me a pause, short, but enough to see I'd found a seam. He shifted the paper so it was perfectly square on his knee. "You have a suspicion. State it." "I think you were meeting her about something she didn't want on paper. Saul was supposed to deliver it. Now he's missing, and so is the item. You were in position to see if it arrived." Calvert's jaw moved once, slowly. "You think I had something to do with his disappearance?" "I think you were watching for him, and if he'd walked into this lobby, you'd have been out of that chair in 3 strides. His gaze held mine, then drifted past my shoulder to the desk clerk. A signal passed there, not obvious, but it didn't need to be. The clerk picked up the phone. I knew when a conversation was over, but I wasn't done yet. "One more thing," I said. "You've spent years moving cargo between here and Lisbon. You've got manifests for ships that aren't even halfway loaded yet." "That's my job." "It's also an interesting route if you wanted to move something, or someone, without customs looking too hard." His mouth smiled, but his eyes didn't. "You've been doing your homework." "I always do." The phone at the desk clicked back into place. The clerk said something I didn't catch, and Calvert stood, smoothing his jacket. "Mr. Goodwin, if you have further questions, you can direct them to my office. I won't promise to answer." He started toward the elevators. I let him go, watching the set of his shoulders and the way he didn't look left or right. He was the kind of man who walked like there was a hatch to close behind him, and I had the sense that whatever was inside would smell of salt water and secrets. I left by the front, stepping into the night air that felt colder than it had an hour ago. Wolfe would want every detail, the tone, the tells, the routes mentioned, and I'd give him all of it, because I was sure of one thing. Henry Calvert was more than a man in a lobby with a newspaper. He was a man waiting for something he hadn't got, and whatever that something was, Saul Panzer had been carrying it. The morning had started with the kind of stillness that made the brownstone seem to float apart from the rest of Manhattan. The city beyond West 35th Street might have been stirring, but here the air was warm and steady, scented faintly with coffee, butter, and the ghost of last night's thyme from Fritz's sauce. I came into the dining room to find Wolfe in his yellow chair, leaning back with the Gazette spread across both hands, as though it were a diplomatic communiqué, and not just another day's assault of headlines. His eyes skimmed, but not idly. Wolfe never read idly. He absorbed. The sideboard was as disciplined as the man who kept it. Breakfast laid out with the precision of a courtroom exhibit. My eggs were domed under a silver cover, the toast stacked like well-milled playing cards, the butter coaxed into pale whirls that looked like they'd been turned by a jeweller. Fritz himself was still at work in the kitchen. I could hear the rhythmic scrape of a knife on the cutting board. I'd just sat down and reached for the coffee when the telephone rang in the office. It wasn't one of those delicate chimes you get in polite households. The brownstone's bell had the self-assurance of a man calling for the check in a crowded restaurant. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even look up from his paper. "You going to get that?" I asked. He turned a page. "You are closer." I got up, crossed into the office, and picked up the receiver. Nero Wolfe's residence. The voice on the other end had the grain of a dockside plank, rough, dry, and soaked through with brine. "That Archie Goodwin." "That's me. Who's asking?" "Friend of Saul Panzer's." The words were slow, almost deliberate, as if the man was weighing each before releasing it. "Name's Rizzo, longshoreman down at Pier 14. Heard you were asking." "That's right. What have you got?" "Depends what you're buying, and I ain't talking cash." From the dining room I caught the faint scrape of a chair leg on the floor. Fritz, no doubt, moving something. His ears were as sharp as his knives. "Try me," I told Rizzo. "I seen Saul Thursday morning. He was down by the piers talking to some fella in a grey overcoat. Didn't look like a union man. After that, Saul was gone. Not seen him since." "You sure about the coat?" "I'm sure about the man. Didn't belong. You spend enough years here, you can smell it." The kitchen door creaked. Fritz was coming through, carrying a plate. He crossed to the dining table without looking at me, but I knew better. He was listening. "What time Thursday?" I asked Rizzo. "Little after 9. Saul was in a hurry. Said he had an errand uptown. I figured it was just another job. But now he's missing." "Yeah, and I don't like it. Saul's solid. He don't skip out on people, not his style." I kept my voice steady. "If you see that man in the grey coat again, call me here." Rizzo grunted. "Will do." The line went dead. I hung up, turned back toward the dining room, and found Fritz setting down my plate with more care than a nurse lowering a newborn. He straightened, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked at me the way a man looks when he's been holding back a remark. "You spoke with a man from the docks," he said, his accent touching each consonant. "That's right." I sat down. "And this is about Mr. Panzer." I nodded. Fritz rarely ventured into the business end of Wolfe's affairs. He considered it a separate kitchen, one that operated on recipes he neither understood nor cared to sample. But Saul was different. Fritz liked him. They had an understanding born of quiet efficiency. "Saul," Fritz said, "is careful. Always. He pays for his coffee before it is poured. If he leaves a taxicab, he gives more than he owes. He does not leave debts." "That's true," I admitted. Fritz glanced toward Wolfe, who had lowered the paper just enough to regard us. "If he is gone, it is not because he runs from something he owes. Perhaps he was paid." I raised an eyebrow. "Paid for what?" "For whatever he was going to do Thursday morning." It wasn't much, but in this house even a half sentence from Fritz on a case was worth weighing. Wolfe must have agreed because he set the paper down, steepled his fingers and looked at me. "Archie, you will check his bank." "His bank?" "Mr. Panzer is fastidious with his accounts. If he received a sum, large enough to justify vanishing from your company, it will be recorded." "And you think that happened?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Fritz has an unblemished record in judging the habits of men who come to our table. If he asserts that Mr. Panzer would never leave a debt unpaid, then we may presume that any sudden absence was not avoidance but perhaps consequence, which is Wolfe speak for follow the money." I made the call to the bank from the office, passing myself off as a man verifying a detail for an insurance policy. I've been hung up on by experts, but not this time. The clerk, polite and oblivious, confirmed that on Thursday morning, the same morning Rizzo saw him at the pier, Saul Panzer withdrew exactly $1,000. I hung up and sat there a moment, letting the number settle in my head. It wasn't the kind of amount you carried for cab fare. It was the kind you took when you didn't plan on coming back soon, or at all. Back in the dining room, I gave Wolfe the figure. His brows pressed together, not in surprise, but in confirmation. 1,000, he repeated. "That's right. Cash." He reached for his beer, took a measured sip, and then, almost idly, said, "Delia Hawthorne paid me that amount 2 days before Mr. Panzer vanished." The connection was immediate, like the click of a chambered round. I said, "You think it's the same money?" "I think," Wolfe replied, "that coincidences of exact sum are the refuge of lazy minds. In our trade, they are evidence." Fritz collected my empty plate, his face unreadable, but I caught the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. He had, without meaning to, set the stage, and Wolfe, as always, knew when the curtain had just gone up. The rain had lost its ambition by the time I left the brownstone, but the air still carried the damp insistence of a city that meant to keep you uncomfortable. Wolfe had not raised his voice, but there was a weight to his instruction that had me out the door without the usual ceremony. A body had been pulled from the ferry slip at the end of West 23rd, and he wanted to know whether it was Saul. The taxi's heater was making a valiant but losing effort. The driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, as if I might hand him a better fare by magic. I gave him the address again, just to keep him from deciding he'd heard wrong, and settled back. Manhattan, slicked with rain, has a way of muting its own noise. Streetcars clanged more distantly, footsteps softened, and even the usual cab horns sounded reluctant. By the time we turned toward the piers, the smell of the river had found me. Salt and diesel, with that faint metallic edge you get when water has been shoving against steel too long. A uniform waved us off before the taxi could nose in too close. I paid, stepped out, and was met by a gust sharp enough to crease the brim of my hat. The slip was a collage of oil-sheened water, swaying ropes, and the kind of faces you don't see unless something has gone wrong. Patrolmen trying to look authoritative while they waited for orders, dockhands drawn in by curiosity, and one or two men in suits whose shoes would regret the choice. Lieutenant Rowcliffe was there, which told me all I needed about how quickly news had travelled. He saw me, his expression flattening like dough under a rolling pin. "Goodwin," he said, making it sound like I'd shown up to ruin his day. "I hear you've got someone out of the drink," I said, keeping my hands in my coat pockets. "Not your business." "Then I'll stand here until it becomes mine." He gave me a long look, the kind reserved for deciding whether to throw a man out or make him useful, then jerked his head toward the water. The police launch was easing into the slip, two men crouched near the bow. Between them, the tarp-covered outline of a man. It took a minute for them to get him onto the dock. Even under the tarp I could see the build was close to Saul's. My stomach didn't flip. Wolfe had sent me because he preferred confirmation to speculation, but there was enough in the shape of those shoulders to make the air feel heavier. The tarp came back with a reluctant peel of wet canvas. It wasn't Saul. The face, slack in death, was familiar for another reason. Scar running from the left corner of his mouth to the jaw. The same taxi driver I'd seen down at Pier 14. The one who'd made himself scarce the moment I'd asked a question too many. Rowcliffe's tone carried no sympathy. "Recognize him?" I gave him the truth. "Yeah. He was driving a hack out of Pier 14 2 nights ago. Didn't like questions, and he had a talent for disappearing." "Looks like he lost it," one of the launchmen said. "More to his boots than to us. The body was waterlogged, hair flattened in odd directions, clothing clinging like it meant to hold him together. A river death will make you look smaller, but even so, the man had been solid. His coat, sodden and darkened, hung heavy enough to need 2 men to shift him. One of the uniforms crouched and began going through the pockets. You could hear the wet slap of cloth being turned out. A wallet, limp with river water, came first. Rowcliffe took it, flipped it open, frowned. Nothing worth the trouble. Then the cop's hand came up with a scrap of paper, no bigger than a folded matchbook cover. It was half a page torn from a larger sheet, the edges ragged, the ink blurred from its swim. Even so, you could see it had once been part of a passenger list, names set in a neat column, each with a cabin number beside it. One name was circled in pencil. Delia. The surname was half gone, water having claimed it, but the first name was clear as a signature on a cheque. I took a step closer, just enough to make sure I wasn't seeing ghosts. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked. Rowcliffe's eyes narrowed. "You think this ties to your little errands for Wolfe?" "I think," I said evenly, "that Wolfe will want to know a taxi driver from Pier 14 had Delia's name in his pocket when he died." That bought me the scrap. He handed it over like he was giving away a favour he'd regret. The paper was cold, slick in a way that made you want to drop it. The pencil mark was firm, deliberate enough that the water hadn't erased it completely. Whoever circled it had wanted it seen. The crowd was starting to thin, the novelty of a dead man giving way to the reality of wet boots and missed lunches. The launch crew began the business of moving the body toward the wagon. The driver's face was already losing what little colour it had left, settling into that grey anonymity the river gives back. I slipped the paper into an envelope from my coat, keeping it flat. No point letting the last of the pencil smear. "Any idea how he went in?" I asked. Rowcliffe shrugged. No obvious wounds. Could have been a slip. Could have been a shove. And the odds of him just happening to be carrying part of a passenger list with Delia's name. Your problem, Goodwin. He turned away, already signalling to a pair of detectives, which was as much invitation as I was going to get. The wind shifted as I stepped back toward the street, carrying with it the long, low groan of a ferry horn somewhere upriver. It sounded tired, the way the city does when it's had to witness something it would rather forget. I flagged another cab, gave the driver the address of the brownstone, and settled in with the envelope pressed flat in my pocket. The city slid by, rain glossing every surface until even the gutter water looked dressed for an occasion. Wolfe would want the facts, stripped of the river's theatrics. I could give him that. What I couldn't give him yet was the reason a man with a scar on his chin, a hack license, and no business knowing Delia's name had ended up face down in the slip. That part, I suspected, would take more than a ferry ride to answer. The knock came at 9:30, just as I was weighing whether another cup of coffee was worth the trouble of dealing with Fritz's morning disapproval. It was the kind of knock that doesn't wait for permission. Heavy, short, and certain. I put the cup down and crossed the hall, already rehearsing a line about not taking deliveries before 10. When I opened the door, Inspector Kramer stood on the stoop, hat pulled low against the drizzle, cigar clamped like a statement of war. His coat was slick at the shoulders, and his eyes had the dull gleam of a man who'd been awake too long and liked it less with each minute. "Morning, Kramer," I said, because technically it was. "Save it," he growled, brushing past me into the hall. The scent of rain, cheap overcoat wool, and his inevitable tobacco trailed in behind him. "Wolfe in?" I closed the door. Where else would he be? He didn't bother answering. I followed him into the office where Wolfe was in his yellow chair, the Gazette open in a perfect square, an untouched bottle of beer on the side table. He didn't look up until Kramer's shoes reached the edge of the rug. "Good morning, Inspector," Wolfe said, his voice the sound of a man for whom mornings were negotiable. Kramer didn't take the red chair right away. He stood over the desk like an uninvited storm, water darkening the brim of his hat. "You're obstructing justice, Wolfe." Wolfe lowered the paper. "Am I?" "You are. You've got Delia Mason tucked away somewhere, and you know it. She's material to my case, and you're playing hide-and-seek." I took my seat at my desk, mostly to avoid being in the direct path of what promised to be a long exchange. Wolfe set the Gazette aside, leaning back as if Kramer had accused him of watering orchids improperly. "Miss Mason," Wolfe said, "is a client. Client matters are privileged, you know that." "This isn't privilege, it's obstruction," Kramer shot back. "We've got a body in the river, $1,000 missing from Saul Pantzer's account, and a matching 1,000 in Mason's hands. You expect me to ignore that?" Wolfe glanced at me. "Archie?" "Confirmed," I said. Saul pulled the 1,000 in cash 2 days before he disappeared. Delia deposited the same amount the following morning. Her bank's in good order, and the bills match the serials on Saul's withdrawal slip. Kramer jabbed the air with his cigar. "There. You've got motive, opportunity." "I have facts," Wolfe interrupted, his tone iron under velvet. "Facts do not compel surrender of a client to your tender mercies." Kramer's jaw worked around the cigar. "You think you're clever, sitting here fattening up on your retainer while I'm out dragging the river?" "That," Wolfe said, "is the nature of our respective vocations. I do not presume to tell you how to search the river. Do not presume to tell me how to conduct an investigation." It was a neat shot across the bow, but Kramer wasn't about to strike colours. He pulled off his hat, dropped it on the edge of my desk without so much as a glance in my direction, and leaned in over Wolfe's blotter. "You want to play it like that? Fine, but you're going to hand over everything you've got from Panzer's apartment. I know you sent Goodwin sniffing around there." "Sniffing is Archie's natural state," Wolfe murmured. I gave him a look he didn't return. "We didn't remove anything without cause," I said to Kramer. His eyes narrowed. "What about the torn envelope? That was interesting. I hadn't told him about the envelope. My brows went up, but Wolfe stayed precisely where they belonged. "It is in my possession," Wolfe said evenly. "You may not have it." Kramer's laugh was short and without humour. "And why not?" "Because," Wolfe said, "it is part of a chain of inference I'm constructing. Until I'm satisfied that relinquishing it will not prejudice my client's position, it remains here." I could see the muscle twitch in Kramer's cheek. He didn't like that answer, and he liked knowing he couldn't do a thing about it even less. Wolfe let the silence run until it was nearly uncomfortable, then added, "I will, however, permit you to examine it. Here, under my supervision." "That's generous," Kramer said, but the sarcasm didn't hide the calculation in his eyes. He knew a partial concession when he saw one. I opened the top drawer of my desk and took out the envelope, placing it on the blotter between them. It was standard manila, one edge torn raggedly where it had been opened in haste. The postmark was smeared, but the faint scent was still there if you leaned close enough. Kramer did. His brow furrowed. "Cigar smoke." "Not smoke," Wolfe said. "Tobacco oil. The paper absorbed it." I watched Kramer straighten, the wheels turning. "You've got a brand in mind?" "I do," Wolfe replied, "but I shall not name it until I have confirmed it. When I do, you will be informed." "That's something," Kramer allowed. He glanced at me. "You vouch for that, Goodwin?" "I vouch for nothing that ties my shoelaces to anyone else's case," I said. "But yes, I smelled it. Same as Saul's coat pocket when we checked his apartment." That was the first I'd said that detail aloud, and I didn't miss the quick flicker in Kramer's eyes. He was filing it away. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands across his vest. "You may also wish to note that the tobacco in question is not of the type available in ordinary tobacconists. It is imported, and its distribution is limited." "Limited to who?" Kramer asked. "When I have proof, Inspector, not before." For a moment I thought Kramer might slam a fist on the desk. Instead, he picked up his hat, turned it in his hands, and set it back on his head with the slow precision of a man who knew losing his temper, here, wouldn't win him the war. "You keep playing it close, Wolfe, but if that girl slips out of your hands before I get her statement, I'll have your license in front of a judge before you can say habeas corpus." Wolfe inclined his head. "Noted." Kramer turned on his heel and headed for the door. I followed because it's my job to see people out, especially when they leave in a mood that suggests the front door might get slammed hard enough to rattle Fritz's silver. At the threshold, Kramer paused. "If you get anything, and I mean anything, that ties Panzer's money to his disappearance, you call me." I didn't answer. He stepped into the drizzle, the brim of his hat catching the rain, and strode down the steps to where his car idled at the curb. I closed the door and went back to the office. Wolfe had reclaimed his paper, the envelope now back in my desk. "You think he'll let you keep playing it this way?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe said without looking up, "that Inspector Kramer has learned the limits of his reach. For today." The beer bottle on his table hissed faintly as he opened it, the sound small against the patter of rain on the windows. It was just before 4 when Wolfe looked up from the stack of bills on his desk and made the kind of remark that means my evening is about to be ruined. "Archie, you will go down to West Street." He didn't look at me when he said it. That's part of the technique. Keep the tone casual, keep the eyes on the paper, as if the matter was too trivial to require human contact. "West Street where?" I asked. "Near the piers," he said. "Observe the surroundings between Houston and Canal." I knew better than to press for detail. Wolfe believes in dribbling out information like an eyedropper, one fact at a time, and never more than the bare dose required to get me moving. I closed my notebook, checked my watch and reached for my hat. "Any particular reason?" I said, just to give him the chance to slip and reveal something. "Yes," Wolfe said, and went back to the bills. The day was grey enough to make the Hudson look like it had been rolled in ashes. I took a cab because it was either that or let the wind off the water cut my ears in half. The driver left me near Pier 34, and I stepped into the smell of the river, a mix of salt, rust, and the slow rot of timbers that have been holding up too many years of cargo. Waterfront traffic was the usual blend of stevedores, dock clerks, and men who moved like they had cargo to deliver, but no ship to take it. Trucks rumbled over the cobblestones. Gulls made their usual commentary overhead. I walked toward Houston Street, keeping to the east side of West Street where I could watch the doorways. Wolfe had given me nothing to go on, but when he sends me to look, it's because there's something, or someone, worth seeing. That someone appeared 3 blocks later. It was the kind of moment that happens once in a blue moon, when the crowd tilts just so, the light shifts, and a face you thought was gone for good steps into view. Saul Panzer. He was across the street, moving at a pace that was casual but deliberate, not the easy stroll he uses when he's shadowing a man, but the kind that says he knows exactly where he's going. He was clean-shaven, overcoat collar turned up, hat brim low. The only thing out of place was that I was looking at him at all. I stepped to the curb, waiting for a truck to roar by, and crossed. By the time I hit the other sidewalk, Saul was slipping into a narrow lunchroom with a tin coffee pot painted on the window. I followed. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of frying onions and the sweet metallic edge of overworked coffee urns. A half-dozen men in work coats were hunched over the counter, talking low. Saul was at the far end, leaning against the wall with a cup in front of him. I walked up like I'd been expected. "You're a hard man to find." He didn't look up. "You found me." "You've been off the map for a week. Wolfe's been—" Saul raised his eyes, just enough for me to catch the message. "Not here." I slid onto the stool next to him. The counterman poured me coffee without asking. I kept my eyes on the mirror behind the counter, the one that let you see the whole room without turning. Saul said quietly, "I can't break cover yet." That was enough to freeze me halfway to my first sip. "Cover?" He gave a faint shake of the head. "Working an angle. Bigger than you think. Tell Wolfe I'm fine." "That'll thrill him." Saul allowed the smallest flicker of a smile. "Tell him to sit tight. And Archie." He hesitated just long enough to make it count. "Don't trust Delia." The name landed like a pebble in a still pond. Delia, whose testimony Wolfe had been weighing like a goldsmith over a scale. "You're going to have to do better than that," I said. "Can't. Not now. It's not the police I'm avoiding." There was a sound from the front door, the bell jingling sharp in the close air. Saul's eyes shifted past me, then back. His hand came up, not to touch me, just to hold me in place. "Let me work it." Before I could answer, he slid off the stool, left a coin on the counter, and moved toward the back door. The other men didn't so much as glance at him. By the time I was on my feet, he was gone. I stepped outside into the narrow service alley behind the lunchroom. The wind off the river cut straight through my coat. A trash can lid rattled somewhere, and a delivery truck idled at the far end. No Saul. He'd melted into the waterfront like a man who had been practicing the trick all his life. I walked back around to West Street. If Wolfe had been hoping for a long conversation, he was going to be disappointed. But I had a name, Delia, and a fact. Saul Panzer was alive, on the job, and spooked by something that could make the NYPD look like a soft option. The cab ride back to the brownstone felt longer than the trip down. Wolfe was in the office when I came in, behind the desk, fingers steepled, as if the bills had been a minor diversion while he waited for the news. "Well?" I found him. "And?" "He's working an angle. Told me to tell you to sit tight." I paused. "And he said not to trust Delia." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking. Ha! That one syllable meant he was already rearranging the pieces in his head. I'd given him the two I had. The rest was his business, until he sent me out again. The fog was clinging to the Hudson that morning, the sort of damp that crept under collars and settled in the seams of your coat. From my seat in the cab, the piers were a line of shadowed hulks, each warehouse front staring out at the river like a row of tired old sentries. The driver let me out 2 blocks short of the slip Wolfe had specified. I paid him, stepped into the smell of salt and diesel, and joined the slow trickle of dock hands heading toward the gates. I had the name of one of them in my pocket, Lenny Ferris, written on a slip of paper in Wolfe's neat, square hand. He had come to us, through one of those indirect paths information travels in this city, and hinted that he had something to say about a Lisbon-bound freighter and its paperwork. My job was to meet him where his foreman wouldn't see and find out why Wolfe had raised an eyebrow when the man's name came up. A gull wheeled above the cranes as I found the break in the fence and stepped through. A longshoreman in a frayed cap glanced up, saw I wasn't wearing a badge or a clipboard, and went back to his work. The air was thick with the scrape of metal on wood, the thud of crates hitting the pier. I kept my pace casual. In a place like this, anyone moving too fast was either running from something or running it. Ferris was waiting in the lee of a stack of shipping barrels, a cigarette tucked into the corner of his mouth. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with eyes that flicked side to side even before I reached him. "You're Goodwin?" he asked, not bothering to hide the name. "That's right. You're Ferris." He nodded once. "Don't want to talk here. Follow me." We wound between stacks of cargo until the sound of the winches was dulled to a hum. He stopped beside a pallet of burlap sacks, glanced around and lowered his voice. "There's a trunk," he said. "Big one. Loaded on the Santa Maria yesterday afternoon, not on the regular manifest, or at least not under its real description. The papers say it's machine parts from a company that's been dead for 10 years. Whose company? I asked, though I could already feel where this was going. He met my eyes. Name on the manifest is Varela Shipping. That ring a bell? It did. I'd seen it 2 nights ago in a folder Wolfe had kept open on his desk longer than usual. Delia's late father had run Varela Shipping until his death, and the ink had barely dried on the probate papers before the business went under. Ferris took a drag on his cigarette and blew the smoke toward the river. The trunk's locked, heavy. Took 3 men to get it from the truck onto the hoist. Whoever signed for it knew how to keep eyes off it. Wrong pier number on the delivery slip, different handwriting on every copy. Somebody's hiding it, and they don't want it inspected. You think it's contraband? He shook his head slowly. I've seen liquor, gold, paintings, you name it. This wasn't packed like freight. The balance was off, and there was a shift when we set it down, like something inside moved, not rolling, shifting. I didn't press him for what he thought was in it. The way he avoided the word said enough. Anyone else know about this? I asked. Not unless they were watching the hoist crew close, and if they were, they weren't union. I kept my mouth shut. You ask questions on the pier, you don't always get to finish the day. I took out my notepad and made a small mark. Not words, just a symbol Wolfe would recognize. Where's the trunk now? Hold number 3, forward. Supposed to stay there until we clear customs in Lisbon. But if you wanted it gone before then, he let the thought hang. No, I said. We'll settle for knowing it's there. His eyes narrowed. You planning to tell the cops? Not yet. He gave a humorless laugh. Figures. Whoever this is, they've got reach. More than the harbour patrol. If it was just goods, I wouldn't care. But I've been on long enough to know the difference between dead weight and... He stopped again, and his shoulders shifted. Look, I don't want to be here when the wrong person notices you. You got what you came for. He ground out the cigarette against the pier and walked off without another glance. I watched him go, then headed for the gate. The cab ride back to the brownstone was slow, clogged by a stalled truck on 10th Avenue. I let the delay work for me, turning over what Ferris had said. The name on the manifest wasn't coincidence. Wolfe didn't believe in those. A dead company shipping machine parts to Lisbon was strange enough. Add the weight, the secrecy, and the connection to Delia's family, and it began to feel less like smuggling goods and more like smuggling something, or someone, alive. By the time I stepped into the warm quiet of the brownstone, the fog had left its mark on my coat. Fritz appeared from the kitchen doorway with a frown, eyeing the damp shoulders. Nothing a brush won't cure, I told him, and headed for the office. Wolfe was at his desk, yellow chair angled toward the orchids in the corner. The Gazette lay folded beside the blotter, and his eyes lifted as I came in. Well, he said. I gave him the facts without embroidery. Ferris's description, the name on the manifest, the locked trunk in hold number 3. When I was done, Wolfe sat back and touched his fingertips together. Varela Shipping, he said, pronouncing each syllable as if weighing it. Curious. That enterprise was dissolved in 1939. According to Ferris, it's alive enough to send mystery trunks to Lisbon. He regarded me for a moment, then reached for a slim volume from the shelf behind him. The papers will say machine parts. The truth is otherwise. You think it's people? I think it is possible, he said. The war scattered many. Some found passage through channels more circuitous than steamship lines, and there are those who would pay to move human cargo unseen. If that's true, why link it to Delia's father? That, Archie, is what we must learn. I leaned against the red chair and studied him. Ferris said the balance was wrong. Something inside shifted when they set it down. Wolfe's mouth compressed. A single person, perhaps, or 2, if they are desperate, locked away for days before departure. It is distasteful. What do you want me to do? Nothing, for the moment. We cannot storm a freighter, and the harbour police would either bungle it or alert those responsible. We shall watch. The trunk is not scheduled to be moved until after departure. That gives us time. Time for what? His eyes closed briefly, as if the question were impertinent. To determine who ordered it loaded, and why they chose that name. I left him to his thoughts and crossed to my desk. Outside, the street was losing its fog to the pale noon light, but the smell of the river seemed to have followed me in. Somewhere on Pier 12, a locked trunk was waiting in the hold of the Santa Maria, and whatever was inside, Wolfe intended to open it, one way or another. The afternoon light through the south windows had gone weak and cold, the kind that made the yellow of Wolfe's chair seem warmer than it was. He had the Gazette open in front of him, one broad finger holding his place, though I doubted he was reading. He was in that listening pose, eyes low, head slightly forward, as if the air itself might bring him a confession. I'd just closed the front door on a January draft when Delia Markham appeared on the threshold of the office. Her gloved hand lingered on the jamb, as though she needed a second to decide whether she wanted to cross into Wolfe's domain. She was in a dark blue coat that had seen better years and a hat tilted forward enough to throw a shadow over her eyes. "Miss Markham," I said, pulling the door wider. "You're right on time. Wolfe hates being kept waiting." Her gaze shifted from me to Wolfe. He had not moved, but for the faintest inclination of his head. "Sit, Miss Markham." The red leather groaned as she settled into it. I took my chair at the end of the desk, notebook ready. The scent of her perfume, faint, something floral that had been bottled long before the war, barely reached across the space between us. "You said," Wolfe began, his voice precise, "you wish to revise an earlier statement." Delia's gloved hands tightened in her lap. Yes, I realize I may have misled you. Not deliberately, but I left something out." "That is not a distinction I relish," Wolfe said. "Proceed." Her eyes darted to me, then back to Wolfe. "It's about the trunk, the one you asked me about. Saul Pantzer was meant to deliver me something. Papers. Proof that Horace Calvert arranged for my father's death at sea." I wrote it down without looking up. "Proof," I repeated, to keep her going. She nodded quickly. "Letters, contracts. I don't know the form exactly, but the trunk, it's supposed to have them." Wolfe's brows dipped, not in surprise but in calculation. "You claim these documents implicate Calvert in your father's death?" "Yes. My father died aboard the Montevallo in 1943, in the North Atlantic. Calvert, he had him placed on that voyage. My father was carrying information, dangerous information. The ship went down, Calvert lived, my father didn't." The ticking of the wall clock filled the pause. Wolfe's eyes closed halfway. "When, Miss Markham, did Calvert join the firm of Halberd and Sloane?" She frowned. "In 1945. Why?" "In 1943, Wolfe said. He was employed elsewhere. The war still consumed the Atlantic lanes, and his reach, if any, did not extend to maritime assignments. Your father could not have been placed on a vessel by Calvert before 1945. Her shoulders tensed. "You're saying I'm wrong about the year?" "I am saying," Wolfe replied, "that your assertion of Calvert's agency in 1943 is untenable. Either your date is wrong, or your accusation is." Delia looked down at her gloves as if they might supply the answer. My mother told me it was 1943. I never checked. She was certain." Wolfe made a sound in his throat, not quite a sigh. "Certainty is the consolation of those unwilling to consult fact." He reached for his beer, sipped and set it down with deliberation. "You say Saul was to deliver these documents. Where are they now?" Her voice lowered. "The trunk is still in the storage yard on Pier 19, locked. I haven't been able to get near it without someone watching." I asked, "Who's doing the watching?" She hesitated. "Men I don't know. They're there at all hours. One of them followed me once as far as Lexington. She broke off, shaking her head. "That's why I didn't tell you before. I thought, if I mentioned it—" "You thought it might compel us to act before you were ready," Wolfe finished for her. "It did not occur to you that withholding the genesis of your interest in this trunk would impair our ability to judge its relevance." Delia's voice was small. "I was afraid." "Phooey." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. "Fear is no excuse for mendacity." She flinched but didn't look away. "Will you help me get it? The trunk?" "That," Wolfe said, "is a matter for Mr. Goodwin to determine. He will consider whether a walk to Pier 19 is worth the potential exertion." I didn't commit either way, but my pen slowed. "What about the documents? If they're in there and they do tie Calvert to—" Wolfe lifted a finger. "If Miss Markham's chronology is in doubt, her facts unverified, and her motives—" He let the sentence trail off, leaving the rest to imagination. Delia's eyes were fixed on him now. I know what I'm saying sounds complicated, but it's true. My father's death wasn't an accident. If I can get those papers— If, Wolfe said again, you can get them, and if they are what you say, they may be useful. But until the year of your father's death and Calvert's association are reconciled, your account remains suspect. The room went still. Outside, a horn blared, then faded into the city's winter hush. Delia reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small slip of paper, and placed it on the desk. The key to the storage lock, in case you decide I'm worth believing. I took it before Wolfe could decide whether to touch it. The brass was cold against my palm. Wolfe's gaze had settled on her again, as if he might, through sheer force of observation, rearrange her into a version that fit the facts. You will be available if summoned? Yes, she said, day or night. He closed his eyes. I despise the night for business, but very well. She rose, smoothed her coat, and crossed to the door. I followed, holding it open long enough to catch her perfume again, faint, like something remembered rather than worn. When I came back, Wolfe was studying the slip of paper I'd set beside his beer. We will verify the date of her father's death before we lift so much as a latch, he said. And if it turns out she's right about the trunk, I asked. He exhaled through his nose. Then, Archie, we shall see whether Miss Markham's story is merely altered, or has been an invention from the start. The evening began with Wolfe in his yellow chair, the lamplight brushing the spines of the books behind him. He had just finished with the orchids and was settling in with a glass of beer when he fixed me with the look that meant work. Archie, he said, you will see to it that Mr. Calvert learns we are in possession of the trunk's contents. I set down my notebook. Subtlety or full brass band? A whisper will suffice. The essential point is that he believe it. Let him imagine, if he must, that I will offer them for sale. Wolfe's gaze returned to the pages in his lap. We will not sell them, of course. I knew the kind of whisper Wolfe meant. An hour later, I was at Lon Cohen's desk at the Gazette, dropping the hint over a cup of coffee. Lon didn't ask questions, he only raised an eyebrow and said he might mention it in the right ear. By the time I reached the brownstone again, the bait was in the water. The rest was waiting. Wolfe passed the hours with his book. Fritz disappeared into the kitchen. I kept my jacket on, parked in the office with the lights low, and the safe unlocked just enough to look tempting. At 10:30 the bell rang. Fritz, true to form, didn't stir. I went to the door. A tall man in a dark coat stood on the stoop, hat brim low. Delivery, he muttered, holding up an empty clipboard. I opened the chain an inch. To who? He moved too fast for a signature. One shove, and the door came wide. I stepped back, hand on my pocket, but he didn't look at me. His eyes went straight for the office. Hold it, I said. He didn't. His shoes hit the carpet, and a second later he was at the safe, crouched. His hands were on the dial when the front door swung in again. Police! Kramer's voice snapped like a whip. 2 uniforms were with him, and in less than 10 seconds the intruder's wrists were in steel. Wolfe didn't stand. He didn't have to. He only looked over the top of his book as Kramer came in with the man. You tipped me in time, Kramer said to me. Good thing. He had the tools for it. The man said nothing. His hat was off now, and sweat had started at his hairline. One of the uniforms went through his pockets, pulling out a thin envelope. Kramer took it, slid a finger under the flap, and drew out a rectangle of paper. Even from across the room I saw the printed heading, Compagnie Coloniale de Navigation. Passenger ticket, Kramer said. Lisbon. Name on it. Calvert. Wolfe's eyes left the page for the first time. How provident, he murmured. He was planning to leave the country. Kramer's jaw tightened. And we'll find out why. I'll have my men keep the ticket. You'll get a statement in the morning. The uniforms walked the man out. The door shut, and quiet settled in again. Wolfe turned another page in his book. Archie, he said without looking up, you may telephone Mr. Calvert tomorrow. Tell him we have something to discuss. About the trunk? About Portugal, Wolfe replied and sipped his beer. The fog over the pier lay heavy as wool, curling around the warehouse lamps and the line of crates waiting for inspection. The police launch had moored an hour ago, its crew now standing aside while Kramer's men worked. I kept to the edge of the scene, notebook ready, coat collar turned up against the cold that came off the water. Beside me, Saul looked as if the damp couldn't touch him, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the trunk that had been the focus since it was lifted from the hold. The trunk itself was unremarkable. Battered leather, brass corners dulled with age, one corner scarred where it had been dropped. But the lock was new, the kind you bought when you cared more about keeping people out than preserving appearances. Kramer crouched, snapped the seal, and nodded for the two uniforms to lift the lid. The hinges groaned. A stale scent came first, not rot, but the closeness of something sealed too long. Then the sight, not documents, not clothes, but the slight form of a boy, curled beneath a wool blanket. His hair was dark, damp against his forehead. A small hand lay open on the lining, palm up, fingers slack. One of the uniforms swore under his breath. "He's alive," the other said quickly, fingers at the boy's throat. Pulse is steady, breathing slow. Kramer straightened, his jaw working. "Get the doc medic." The uniforms moved fast, one jogging toward the office. The medic's kit arrived within minutes. While he worked, I glanced at Saul. He had neither moved nor blinked. His eyes had the stillness of a man measuring the cost of every word. The boy stirred faintly under the medic's hands, a faint sound escaping him. His eyelids fluttered, but did not open. The medic nodded. "Unconscious, probably from exhaustion. No injury I can see. Needs rest, food, and warmth." Kramer turned. "All right, Saul. You're going to tell me why you were hanging about this pier, watching this trunk if you didn't know what was inside." Saul's gaze didn't leave the boy. "I knew." That stopped Kramer mid-step. "You knew?" "I was making sure it wasn't opened by the wrong hands," Saul said. His voice had the calm weight of someone stating a fact, not an excuse. "That boy is the son of a man who hasn't drawn a free breath in 2 years. A man locked in a cell on the orders of a government that doesn't like its critics to live too long." Kramer's face darkened. "You were smuggling him?" "I was moving him," Saul corrected. "From danger to safety. There's a difference." The medic looked up. "He'll wake soon. Better he's not surrounded when he does." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "You could have told me." "And risked a leak before he reached the people who can protect him." Saul shook his head. "No offense, Inspector, but some doors stay shut for a reason." I caught the shift in Kramer's posture, anger pulling against understanding. He wasn't a man to let contraband slip past, even when the contraband had a pulse and a history. But there was a boy in front of him, and the air off the water carried more than cold. It carried the weight of choices that didn't fit neatly into law books. Kramer exhaled hard. "Get him to the infirmary," he told the medic. Then to Saul. "We're going to have a longer talk about this." Saul nodded once. "After he's safe." The medic lifted the boy gently, the blanket wrapping him like a shield. As they carried him toward the waiting car, Saul stepped back into the fog. I followed, the sound of the trunk's lid closing behind us like a verdict deferred. Wolfe sat back in the yellow chair, fingertips meeting in a patient steeple. The air in the office was thick with the faint aroma of beer and the sharper edge of cigar smoke. Archie, Kramer, Delia, Calvert, and Saul were arranged in the red chairs, each holding the stillness of a room where the last word would not be theirs. Fritz had placed the ashtray precisely on Wolfe's desk, though Wolfe had yet to touch it. "Let us begin," Wolfe said, voice even, unhurried. "We have traversed enough detours. The sequence is not complex, but it required patience to unpick." Calvert shifted, his polished shoes catching a slant of light. Wolfe's gaze lingered on him a moment too long to be idle. "You," Wolfe said, "were the architect of Rizzo's murder. Not as an end in itself, but as a mechanism. The boy was in your way, as was Mr. Panzer." Kramer leaned forward. "You're saying Saul was framed?" "I am stating it plainly," Wolfe replied. "Calvert arranged for Rizzo to be killed at the pier, ensuring Saul's presence there at the critical hour. Circumstance and appearance would conspire to make him the villain, while the true benefit, Miss Delia's inheritance, would fall neatly under Calvert's control." Delia's hands tightened in her lap. "I didn't—" "You dissembled," Wolfe interrupted. "Your half-truth served two purposes, to shield yourself from suspicion and to avoid provoking Calvert. You feared him, with reason." Her eyes fell to the carpet, its deep piles swallowing the tremor in her breath. Saul's voice cut in, low but steady. "And the killings at the pier?" "All tied to him," Wolfe said. "Each death removed a potential witness. Each step secured the inheritance. The sequence is meticulous, but it leaves traces." He He reached into the top drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This, for instance. It came to me among your papers, Miss Delia, enclosed with a letter you claimed arrived without handling." Calvert's eyes flickered. "I asked Mr. Goodwin to examine it for irregularities," Wolfe continued. "The paper bore a scent, tobacco, but not any found in this house. It matched precisely the brand you, Calvert, prefer. Your cigarettes are costly and distinct, and you are careless with their odour." Kramer's mouth tightened. "That's enough to place you with it." "It is enough to prove," Wolfe said, "that Calvert handled the envelope meant to lure Saul into the trap. From there the rest follows: motive, opportunity, and the willing deceit of Miss Delia." Calvert straightened. "You can't—" "I can," Wolfe said, his voice sharpening just enough to still the room. "You have been weighed, and the sum is wanting." Kramer rose. "That'll do. Calvert, you're coming with me." Delia's breath caught. Saul's jaw eased, fraction by fraction. Wolfe reached for his beer. "Archie, see them out, then close the door. We have work to conclude." The scrape of chairs and the firm tread toward the hall carried the scene into its last, certain silence. The evening had a sharpness to it, as though Manhattan had drawn in its breath and held it. Inside the brownstone, the air was warmer, layered with the faint scent of orchids drifting down from the plant rooms above. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, immense and motionless, his eyes closed not in rest but in the peculiar, calculated stillness he used when others were meant to fill the silence for him. Calvert was in one of the red chairs, leaning forward, his hands knotted together, the knuckles pale. Across from him, Kramer stood with the deliberate poise of a man holding back the urge to grind a cigarette into the carpet. Saul was angled near the globe, arms folded, expression unreadable. I was in my own chair, pen at the ready. Miss Delia had been persuaded to remain, perched with that practiced stillness some women wear like armour. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Mr. Calvert, the facts no longer orbit the matter. They are in hand. You may speak before the inevitable compels you." Calvert's jaw moved, but no sound came. Kramer shifted his weight. "We can do this two ways," he said, his voice a blunt instrument. "You talk now, and I can note you cooperated. Or you keep sitting there until I have to break you down at the precinct. That's not a pleasant way to spend an evening." Calvert glanced toward Delia, then back to Wolfe. "You're wrong," he said, "but it was the kind of wrong that comes with no conviction." "No," Wolfe replied, "I am not. You employed a driver with a scar on his chin to follow Mr. Pantzer. The man's role was not simply to observe. He was bait, an obvious tail meant to push Saul into the open, to force him into choices you could predict. And when the pier was cleared for your opportunity, you struck." Kramer stepped closer. "The driver's been picked up. Scar like that, hard to miss. He's already talking." A tremor passed through Calvert's hands. "I didn't—" "You did," Wolfe interrupted. "And the progression was methodical. Rizzo was the first obstacle, his hold on certain information making him dangerous to you. The boy was the second. Your intent was to remove both and lay the shadow over Mr. Pantzer." Delia's voice was low, but it cut through. "I told you not to." "You told me nothing of the sort," Calvert snapped, and in that sharpness was the crack Kramer needed. "Let's have it," Kramer said. "All of it." Calvert's gaze went unfocused, as if he were watching some point in the past he couldn't turn away from. "Rizzo was going to sell me out. He'd been running his mouth to anyone who'd buy him a drink. I couldn't have that. The kid, he wasn't supposed to be anything more than leverage, but Saul—" His mouth twisted. "Saul didn't take the bait the way I expected." Saul spoke for the first time, his tone flat. "I took the taxi alone, on purpose." That brought Calvert's head around. I figured you had a tail ready," Saul said, "so I made it easy. Let you see me ride off, no kid in sight. By the time your driver got close enough to be sure, I'd already stashed the boy in the trunk of a car I knew you wouldn't go near. Bought him a few hours you couldn't close." Calvert's breath left him in something close to a laugh, but it died quick. "You think that mattered? You think I wouldn't have found him?" "You didn't," Saul said simply. Wolfe shifted his weight by an inch, for him the equivalent of pacing the floor. "The elegance of your arrangement, Mr. Calvert, was in its apparent inevitability. You intended to be seen as far from the act, with others to bear the stain. Yet it failed because you discounted the intelligence of those you sought to maneuver. Your scar-chinned emissary, your timing at the pier, your assumption that Miss Delia would remain passive. All miscalculations. Delia's fingers tightened around the arms of her chair, but she said nothing. Kramer pulled a small notepad from his pocket. "Keep talking, Calvert. You've already started. Might as well get to the part where you tell me exactly how you set it up." Calvert looked toward the carpet, the pattern swallowing his focus. "I had the driver watch Saul from the moment he left here. I knew where he'd head. Rizzo was predictable. I made sure the driver was obvious enough to push him into the open. Then I came in from the other side. Rizzo never saw me. One strike and he was done. I had the timing down to the minute." "And the boy?" Wolfe asked. "I thought Saul would have him. He didn't. I figured I'd lost him, but I still had Saul in the right place at the wrong time. Kramer, you'd have taken him in and made it stick. That was the plan." Kramer's expression didn't change. "You misjudged two things, Saul's brains and mine." Calvert's eyes flicked up, and in that look was the first spark of real collapse, the moment a man sees the exit door close and hears the lock turn. "It was supposed to be clean," he said, almost to himself. "No noise, no mess, just done." "You've confessed," Wolfe said, his voice flat as stone. "We are done." Kramer slid the notepad back into his pocket. "Not quite. Calvert, you're under arrest for the murders of Rizzo and the boy's guardian. You'll get to tell the rest to a judge." Delia stood, her hands trembling now. "I had no part in it." "No," Wolfe agreed, "but you withheld, and in so doing prolonged the peril. That is yours to reconcile." Kramer moved to Calvert's side. "Up." Calvert rose, shoulders sagging under a weight he hadn't felt until the room stopped letting him lie. Saul stepped aside to clear the way. The sound of their steps toward the door was slow, almost ceremonial. Fritz appeared in the hall, not to open the door but to stand clear as Kramer passed, his presence a silent assurance that the Brownstones' order would soon be restored. When the door shut behind them, Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "Mr. Goodwin, record the essentials for our files. Mr. Panzer, you may retrieve the boy. See to it he is settled where Mr. Calvert's reach cannot extend." Saul gave a brief nod. "Already done." I flipped open my notebook. "And dinner?" Wolfe's brows drew together faintly. "You may inform Fritz that the matter is concluded, and the table may be laid." The room felt different now, not lighter, but contained, the edges of the day's work drawn in tight. Outside, the city would keep its own counsel, as it always did. Inside, the orchids would be misted, the chairs returned to their places, and Wolfe would have his meal without hurry. The case had closed, not with a shout, but with the quiet sound of a man's last defences giving way. In this house, that was more than enough. The storm that had been prowling over the city all afternoon finally made good on its threat, drumming a steady rhythm against the office windows. Wolfe sat in his yellow chair, half turned toward the orchids in their warm alcove, the first glass of beer within reach. Fritz had arranged the tray on the side table with the precision of a man closing a chapter, plates of veal and red cabbage for later, coffee kept hot in the silver pot. I was in my own chair, stretched out enough to suggest the work was done, though Wolfe's attention was on the blossoms rather than me. The air smelled faintly of the rain and the sharp sweetness of the orchids, a combination even the city couldn't spoil. "Well," I said, "Saul managed to give us the best piece of misdirection you never thought of." His eyes shifted to me, just enough to signal I had his ear. "That taxi ride," I said. "He disappears in it alone, every pair of eyes thinking he's headed straight for the meat, and instead the trail goes cold. You couldn't have staged it better." "I could have," Wolfe said, and sipped his beer, "but I will concede its utility." Saul, planted in one of the red chairs with the ease of a man who'd earned the seat, gave a shrug. The ride was nothing. It was what came after that mattered. "You'll get your check in the morning," I told him. He shook his head. "Keep it. The boy's safe, and that's worth more than the fee. Besides, you'll just find a way to spend it on more of those blasted orchid heaters." That got a grunt from Wolfe, which in this house counted as affection. The rain deepened outside, tapping the glass in uneven bursts. Fritz appeared with the first course, moving as quietly as the air itself, and set the plates before us without breaking the calm. Wolfe lifted the fork, his appetite as punctual as ever. "The case is concluded. The rest belongs to Mr. Kramer and the courts." "And to the weather," I said, watching the street lamps blur behind the rain. They'll have a long night of it. Saul stood, straightening his coat. I'll head out before it gets worse. Tell Fritz I'll take a jar of those pickled onions next time. You may, Wolfe said, if there is a next time. The door closed behind him, leaving the quiet to settle again. Wolfe returned to his beer. I reached for the bread, knowing better than to spoil the moment with talk. Outside, the rain kept its steady counsel, and the orchids, indifferent to murder, money, or misdirection, opened their slow, perfect blooms under the lamplight.